Good evening. All right, we're continuing our class regarding biblical concepts tonight. And tonight we're going to be discussing obedience. I have a brief quiz for the married ladies in the audience. You do not have to raise your hand. All right? Just matter of course, think about this. For those of you who have been married, how many of you had the word obey in your vows? Yeah, Jamie did? That's good. Yeah, I know you did. The reason we had obey in our vows is because my mother-in-law insisted on it. I don't know if that was a red flag or not in hindsight. But I said, no, that's fine. That's okay. But PJ has to have it in hers too. But we're going to talk a little bit about obey tonight. Got to turn this thing on. As we talked about in the past, God is an infinite being with infinite knowledge and experience. Man is a finite being with very limited, with very limited knowledge and experience. Man's ability to comprehend the scope and depth of certain concepts is restrained by his limited knowledge and experience. God's infinite love and perfection cannot be easily understood or comprehended by finite man. Man, as the less experienced being, must acquiesce to God's omniscience. This is obedience. This is obedience. We must acquiesce to God's much more. So again, infinite being, unlimited knowledge, we must therefore acquiesce to his. It's kind of like being a child and a parent. You know, if as a parent, my 2-year-old knew everything, but he's only got 2 years experience. And so over the course of time, he began to realize, there's a little bit to be said for experience, for being here for time. Finite man's limited knowledge and experience coupled with free will makes him susceptible to imperfection or sin. God's perfection demands that sins must be punished, justice, which we studied last week. And then we finished last week, and then God's love allows him to make payment to satisfy his justice on man's behalf, which was mercy and grace, which we also talked about last week. So now we come to the concept of obedience. Men, married men, let me ask you a question. Maybe your wife had the term obey in her wedding vows. How many of you married your wife because of obedience? That wasn't the driving factor, was it? I remember when I saw PJ for the first time across the Heritage Cafeteria at Harding University. I will tell you right now, the first thought across my mind had nothing to do with obedience. But we put a lot of stock in obedience. But what I believe, and I think you'll agree with me as we get into this lesson, is obedience is really a demonstration of some other value or some other concept. So for instance, you don't obey just for the sake of obeying. You obey because you're motivated by some other concept. And we'll talk about the motivations around obedience from a biblical perspective and what those may be. And you guys may come up with some more. I came up with about 5 of them. So this is, I always get a kick out of looking at the dictionary. Obedience is defined as the quality or condition of being obedient. Really? The act of obeying. Thank you very much. That tells me a lot. So I kind of had to make up my own. I like this one, behavior that is respectful and mindful of rules and laws. So as we talked about sin, what was the primary necessity around sin? What did you have to be able to have sin? Standards, laws. There had to be something to sin against. Obedience is the same way. You have to have a standard. You have to have something in order to obey. So there has to be a standard. And then this is the one I kind of made up, which is compliance with instruction or prohibition, because obedience goes both ways. It can be, as we talked about with sin, it can be obedience of commission, doing something, or obedience of omission, not doing something. We, collectively, I think, tend to focus on the omission, right? Sin, we don't want to commit sin, and so if you look at the commandments, the tendency is don't do that. Don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't covet, don't. So we focus on obedience by omission. Any thoughts you have around definitions? Somebody has their own definition of obedience? Because I struggled with this. Like I say, Webster did not help me out at all. As we've talked about, obedience is like sin. It requires a standard. Like sin, it can be obedience by commission or omission. Unlike sin, which is generally negative, when we think of sin, it's a negative. Obedience can be both positive and negative. We can obey to the positive, we can obey God, but even the Bible teaches we can obey sin. We can obey our fleshly lust. We can obey Satan. So we can obey to our detriment. Romans 6:16. Obedience is almost always a demonstration of another concept, which is what we talked about before. No one obeys just for the sake of obeying. There's motivation behind your obedience and why you obey. And there are a number of factors that may influence, and it's probably a combination of others. Thoughts that you have? Jack?
I keep going back to husband and wife. I thank God that I married Gail. She's great. She's very smart, but she's also very obedient. And it boiled down to after we became Christians, we studied marriage and husband and wife relationship. And we came to the conclusion that we would both speak our mind. And she would leave it to me to lead. That's the way it played out. And I had the most wonderful experience, and I learned that she was sometimes quite more on the ball than I was.
That's usually the case. Yeah.
I feel like obedience, there's usually some sort of authority that's involved that you are submitting to.
And we're going to talk about that, and it kind of goes to both these points. There's a number of different motivations around obedience. I came up with 5. But it's usually an overlap of a number of them. For instance, love might be a motivator for obedience in a marriage, but there will also be a respect component. And so there will be a number of these that may play into the reason for obedience. Same thing with God. If you look at our obedience to God, why do we do that? Well, love would certainly play a part. Respect would certainly play a part. Fear would certainly play a part. So there's a number of overlaps there where it may be a combination of things. I will tell you that, if the marriage relationship is certainly different, and yeah, obedience plays into it, but it's a mutual respect that leads to that obedience. And if you haven't gotten there, there's a completely different issue. Other thoughts you have? Yes, sir.
I'm not saying this is universal, but frequently or often, at least, there will be an inclination to do the opposite. If you tell me to do something, and it's what I wanted to do to begin with, is it really obeying?
We're going to get there. That's actually one of the things we're going to look at here in a minute, because there are I guess what you would say, sometimes obedience is self-serving. And that's one of our topics here that we're going to discuss, because sometimes, to your point, we obey because, how many of you obey because you want to go to heaven? I mean, to a degree, that's self-serving, right? But there are other reasons that there are other self-serving reasons that we obey. And to your point, if it's something I want to do, it's really easy to obey then, right? PJ says, let's go out and get ice cream right now. Do I have to? There are things that you do because you want to, and you can call it obedience if you want to. Other thoughts you have? Joe?
The thing about, do you want to go to heaven? Now, you can all say all you want to this, but I was baptized for that reason.
Absolutely.
And that's the main reason I'm a Christian.
Yep.
That's the main reason today, at 80 years old, I'm still a Christian, because I want to go to heaven.
That's right.
There's a lot in between that of things that I do because I read it in the scriptures. And some of them I don't like, but I know they're there,
Yeah.
So I think that's the key. If we're not baptized to go to heaven, you've just got wet.
Well, that's exactly right. I didn't say that self-serving reasons were necessarily bad reasons, and especially in that case, it's definitely a positive reason, right? Ham?
I was just going to say, when it talks about obeying, I'm a hymnal kind of guy. And so there's a hymnal we sing a lot, trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. So I think you have to to obey, you have to have a semblance of trust before you can obey.
You have to have a significant amount of trust, because there's a good deal of obedience that is by faith, especially in our walk. For all intents and purposes, our entire walk is by faith and therefore trust. And so obedience comes by that faith. Otherwise, we sin, and what was the definition of sin? We talked about this when we talked about sin? Putting ourselves first. When we put ourselves above God, that is sin.
I couldn't hear exactly what you said, so you said with the trust. The trust is a positive and a negative motivator. We trust the person that we're going to obey, God,
Right.
because of a positive thing, of love. We trust it, faith, if you will, that positive things are going to happen. But we also obey, whether it's a child or whatever here, we obey because we trust that there could be the negative consequence.
So, famous example,
Yeah.
Eve.
Yeah.
Eve trusted the serpent instead of what God had told her, right? Oh yeah, that'll make me wise, right?
Right. But we also choose to obey because we don't want the negative consequence.
That's exactly right.
Because we trust that negative consequence will happen. Maybe because it already happened before, or whatever.
Well,
Getting a spanking or whatever.
And it goes the other way. Sometimes we trust that something we do wrong won't be as bad, or that there won't be consequences, or that we'll get away with it, or that maybe it's the best thing because that's what I want to do. Anything else before we move on? Obedience, and we just talked about this. Obedience can be self-serving. Somebody want to get Deuteronomy 8:1 and then 21:18 through 21.
The whole commandment that I command you today you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply, and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers.
So, who's talking here? The whole command that I give you today. Moses talking to the children of Israel. We're getting ready to go in and take the land. And oh, by the way, if you keep God's command, you get this whole land, and He'll help us take it over. So to some degree, there was a kind of a carrot there, you know. Obey God's command, here's the promise. And 21:18 through 21.
If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who will not obey the voice of his father or the voice of his mother, and though they discipline him, will not listen to them, then his father and his mother shall take hold of him and bring him out to the elders of his city at the gate and place where he lives. And they shall say to the elders of the city, "This is our son, who is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey our voice. He is a glutton and a drunkard." Then all the men of the city shall stone him to death with stones. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and all Israel shall hear and fear.
If that doesn't make its way into your family devotionals. But self-serving, so the opportunity is obey your parents, because what? In the Old Testament, you could be stoned if you didn't. Romans 2:8.
For those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, there will be wrath and fury.
Self-seeking, do not obey the truth, wrath and fury. Ephesians 6:1.
Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right.
See, that should have gone up there with the Deuteronomy 21:18 through 21, shouldn't it? Obey, and that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. Hebrews 13:17.
Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls, as those who will have to give an account. Let those who will have to give an account, let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you.
All right, obey your leaders. Thoughts that you have on obedience from a self-serving perspective? I think sometimes obedience becomes self-serving. It's what does it do for me? What does it do for me? In fact, like I say, you know, our reason for wanting to go to heaven, obedience, is somewhat self-serving.
I don't think that's a bad thing either.
No.
In Hebrews 11:6 says, but without faith it's impossible to please him, for he who comes to God must believe that he is, and he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him.
That's right.
And that's kind of, we sing the song, standing on the promises of God.
Yeah.
He gave promises for that reason.
He gave promises throughout the Bible, right? I mean, we've studied in depth Genesis over the last 6 months roughly, and look at all the promises that were made throughout Genesis. And as you get into Exodus and into Deuteronomy, when Moses is talking to the people, there's whole chapters around blessings and cursings. If you follow me, do everything I say, you know, you'll live, you know, you're going to be living in houses that you didn't build. You're going to have this land, and it'll be, you know, all the things that will be good if you follow the Lord. But then it went the other direction. Everything that's going to be bad if you don't. And they still didn't listen. Other thoughts you have? Good points. All right. Obedience can be a demonstration of love. And remember when we talked about love, but earlier in this session, I talked about the fact that there's a number of things that overlap. So, you know, Joe, we talked about the fact that self-serving. We get baptized because we want to go to heaven. But you know what? Ultimately, there's another component of that, which is love. We've been told to love God. What's the greatest commandment? I say this every time. What is the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. What does it mean to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind?
Mind in the text addresses the entire being of a person.
The entire being of a person. Love the Lord with all your being. If I love God, what am I going to do? Obey. If I love my spouse, we were told, love your wife as, I am to love my wife as I love myself. My wife is to be, a component of me. Deuteronomy 11:1.
His charge, his statutes, his rules, and his commandments always.
Love the Lord your God. Keep his rules, statutes, commandments, because you love him. John 14:15. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. And that's what you see throughout Scripture, right? We sometimes get caught up in the obedience thing because, again, obedience is an act of, can be an act of omission. I don't want to do this. I don't need to, no murder, no adultery, no covetousness, all of those things, and we get to checking boxes. And we forget our motivation. And our motivation is supposed to be because we love God. So I would submit that if you are obedient from the standpoint of just making sure I checked all the boxes, you kind of missed the boat. Remember the story of the rich young ruler? Had he checked all the boxes? Huh? Except one, but that wasn't a box. That box he didn't know he had to check, right? So he checked all the boxes. I've kept these commandments from my youth. What did Jesus say? One thing you lack. One thing you lack. Go and sell all that you have and give to the poor. And he went away sorrowful. One thing you lack. 1 Peter 1:22.
Having purified your souls by your obedience to the truth for a sincere brotherly love, love one another earnestly from a pure heart.
Love one another earnestly. Obedience for love. Because I love God, I will be obedient to God. Probably more than anything, this is the child-adult concept. My children are more apt to obey out of love. Well, and then there's a combination of fear, but we'll get there. But because I am their father. Thoughts that you have around demonstration of love? Obedience can be a demonstration of respect. Respect. Like we were talking about earlier regarding marriage, and so there's a number of things that filter into this. Love is certainly one of them. Obedience in regards to marriage or to a man-wife relationship has a number of components. Love is certainly one of them, but respect has to go, and that goes both ways. So my wife may be obedient because she respects me, but you know what? I'm to respect her as well. Mark 1:23 through 27.
Immediately there was in their synagogue a man with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, "What have you to do with this, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. And they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him."
Did the unclean spirit obey Jesus out of love? You could probably argue that there was a little bit of fear there, but there was certainly respect. He knew exactly who Jesus was, And he knew that Jesus had the power to tell him to leave. And he did. So there was obedience there out of respect, even by an unclean spirit.
This concept of respect, I really like the definition when you started. It's that man being finite, God being infinite, we must submit to his, or acquiesce, I think is the
Yeah.
word we use, but we must submit or acquiesce to his omniscience. And this aspect of respect, there's a lot of that is if you respect God's infinite power. And when Satan came to Eve, and you mentioned this earlier, first thing he did, he asked this question: did God really say you can't eat it?
Right.
That's the introduction to the conversation.
Yep.
And so then she quotes God, right?
Well, kind of. She even gets that wrong, but
Yeah,
okay.
right. But then he says, you will not die. And so he's doing two things. One, he's questioning right off the bat God's omniscience. Did he really say that? He probably made a mistake.
Yeah.
And then
He didn't mean it like that for
and
sure.
then he actually openly says God's flawed.
Uh-huh.
And so he's just really eroding that respect. So then she says,
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, if you go back, then her obedience is again self-serving from the standpoint that, oh, okay, this is going to be good for me. Look how I'll be like God. So that's exactly right. Other thoughts you have regarding obedience demonstrated by respect? Yeah, Jack?
I always think of this from, the older I get, the more I think of this from. Jesus, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and even questioned, is there another plan? But the real, I guess, adult view of Christianity is when you fight with God, but you realize that he's got all the answers that make you happy. And so you submit, and then you do it out of joy after a while. And you don't have to say, do I have to do this? You want to do it. And you get great joy out of it. And that's the way, especially as being 84 this past week, I think about how important it is to do the right thing all the time. Even though you still have your mind that wants to question things.
That's exactly right. And I mean, again, we go back to the kind of that child-adult scenario. You know, when I'm small, when I was a child, I spake as a child. I understood as a child. And if you think about it, God, at his infinite level, we are children. And we think as children. And we understand as children.
He wants us to, he's preparing us to be like him. When we go to heaven, we won't feel out of place.
That's exactly right. Well, and I used the analogy of the glossy white paint a while back. He can't let us into heaven as long as we have sin, right? So, other thoughts you have? Who's got Ephesians 5:33?
Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband.
There we go. And we talked about that. There's that kind of love, respect intermingled in the marriage. And there's this. We should really think about the church has been called the bride of Christ, right? So we ought to have that same love, respect relationship with God and with Christ. And then Hebrews 12:9.
Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of spirits and live?
We all had earthly fathers that disciplined us, and we respected them. And it goes back to that analogy I just used. There's that child-father relationship. Father, having been through the experience and the years and the understanding, knows so much more than the child. By comparison, God is that way with us, having been through the infinity, and we are confined to 84 years. Hopefully longer, Jack. Any other thoughts you have around respect, obedience for out of respect? Obedience can be a demonstration of fear. Obedience can be a demonstration of fear. Let's go to Genesis 22, 11 through 12.
The angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me.
And what's the context there, Matt?
Offering, God tested him, told him to go and offer his son of promise, and he went to do it. And he was this close.
I don't know that you could have I don't know that you could have a bigger test of your fear of God. I can't imagine anything worse than being asked to offer your son. I just can't. And Abraham was willing to do it to prove that he feared God. Now, God didn't let him carry through with it, but, there was the fear of God. If I do not obey God, I don't know what will happen. Thoughts that you have? Who's got Deuteronomy 6, 1 through 3?
Now this is the commandment, the statutes, and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess it, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son and your son's son, by keeping all of his statutes and his commandments, which I command you, all of these days of your life, and that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey.
So there's a little bit of both there, right? There's a little bit of the self-serving, yet there's a little bit of the fear. Make sure you fear God, keep his commandments, keep all that. And if you do that, then there are these blessings associated with that. Colossians 3:22.
According to the flesh, not with eye service, but as men do, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God.
I'm sorry, Jack, can you read that again? I'm having trouble hearing up here.
Okay, maybe my voice. Bondservants, obey in all things. In all things, your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service, as men please, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God.
Bondservants, obey in all things, fearing God. Are we bondservants? Sure are. Paul was a bondservant. He said he was. Fearing God. Ephesians 6:5.
Bondservants, be obedience to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and sincerity of heart as to Christ.
With fear and trembling, with sincerity of heart as to Christ. Again, we are bondservants with fear and trembling. And then Matthew 25, 24 through 26.
He who also had received the 1 talent came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I scattered no seed.
So this was a situation where fear led to disobedience. Well, actually did not lead to disobedience. It led to inaction. The 1 talent man, being fearful of the master, didn't do anything. He had the talent, but he didn't lose it. You got to give him some credit there. But he didn't do anything with it. All right, thoughts that you have before we move on? Yes, sir?
I think that all of the fear that everybody's been talking about, the front of that ought to be respect. It's a respect of fear. I mean, one that bothers me a lot is living in the United States and looking at what we have here, and I have over the last, 28, 29 years,
Right.
how wealthy this church is. Do we really respect and fear God when he says to give as we have prospered? Now, I mean, we look at the numbers here and all, and what's been done with this congregation, and I can say it's probably one of the freest giving of any place I've ever been on that. But that still holds true, and I worry about that, because you think about how much each one of us have of material goods, and all that was because God blessed us with it on there. And that, like it, have we really give back as we have prospered in all of that?
Yeah.
And I think that, and all of those type fears people say are legit, but I think the respect needs to come in there, because I fear God for the reason I just mentioned, just because I respect him and that he has given a command to that.
Well, and so I think there's a fine line between fear and respect anyway. I mean, I think respect is more of a healthy fear, if you will, because I know that there's things that can, yes.
I love how you kind of talked about the different motivations that drive obedience. And you said it, but I'll reinforce it. A lot of times multiple of these are working in parallel. So respect and fear, love and fear, self-serving and fear. But, if you think of one other example of fear, but it is a really nice contrast, is the story of Rahab.
Yep.
So, she's in James chapter 2.
Yep.
Right there next to Abraham.
Yep.
But what she says...
The hall of faith.
Right, she says two things that I think are interesting. One, is she explains why she's helping. Because she's heard about all the stories and the miracles of God leading the Israelites out of Egypt. But so had everyone else.
Yep.
And she said the whole town is trembling. So they had fear, but everybody else except for her were missing one other thing. Now she recognized also God and his infinite power.
Right.
And so there was a fear, but there was also a submission with Rahab.
And to your point, a fear leading to obedience. Yeah, exactly. Good example. Other thoughts you have? Obedience can be a product of environment, and not environment like you think of in terms of the environment, although our example would be might be part of that. But you really end up having not a choice. In other words, this is kind of what I call accidental obedience. Let me give you an example. How many of you have been on I-77 right up here at 485 at rush hour? You have? During that time, did you all obey the speed limit? Because it's a parking lot. You are not going to be going over the speed limit at that time. So you're in a situation where you have no choice but to obey unless you're taking your life in your hands and are willing to drive on the median. Because it's just a parking lot. There are times when you have no choice but to obey. Now, again, I call this accidental obedience because circumstances will not allow you to disobey. It was difficult to kind of find a biblical example of this, but somebody turn over to Mark 4:36 through 41. And I think you'll see why I use this example. Who's got that?
They took him with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking in the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. And they woke him and said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear, and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?"
Did the wind and the sea have a choice? No. I mean, think about it. He was part of creation. He created the wind and the sea. If he wants to stop them, they have no choice. So again, this is obedience because there is no other choice but obedience. Other thoughts you have? I know this was but as I was trying to think through all the possibilities around obedience, there are times when we are obedient because we have no choice.
He told the people in the ship, throw me overboard.
Yep.
And they had no other choice but to.
That's right. You know, Jonah goes on the run. He's going to run from God. He's going to go the opposite direction from Nineveh. And God kind of goes, nope. And, you know, Jonah was going to end up going to Nineveh regardless. He had no choice. He was going regardless whether he wanted to or not. Other thoughts you have? Yes, sir, Robert? I see a perplexing look on your face, like, Mark, you're way off base here.
It's a stretch.
Okay, yeah.
But here's where my head went. If you think about environment being the environment we grow up in, or the environment we train our children in, our house, our rules, you know, then this concept of obedience is something that they do because that's part of their nature.
That's good. I like that.
You know, as Christians, when we come up out of the waters of baptism, we come up a new creature. And so obedience is, we still have free will, of course, and may choose to disobey, but obedience is an act of us demonstrating who we are, our changed nature. You know, and so in that sense, I told you it was a stretch. But
No, it's not.
You know,
and it actually is a point that I probably should have included in this lesson from the standpoint. And so I think, let me try to sum up a little bit, but to some degree, obedience is a learned trait. Does that kind of help with that? Matt?
Well, I agree with Robert, and I think it's also what Jack was saying earlier. You know, first, it very much is a struggle, and maybe you're doing it out of self-serving, and maybe over time, and also fear, and maybe over time it becomes love. And at some point, and I think this may be where Robert's going, is it becomes a habit.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's not to say we don't have any struggles, but some things become habitual in a good way. And that's kind of this.
It's, again, it's a learned trait. To your point, as we learn and develop and grow, it becomes habitual. It becomes more of a habit as opposed to yes. It becomes muscle memory is kind of what I'm going to. Yes, Jack?
My performance moved into a retirement community where we have 63% widows and a very smaller amount of widowers. And then we have husband and wives that are still alive and kicking. I made it my goal when I moved there that I was going to obey God in taking care of the widows. And I have a reputation that
Uh-oh.
No.
I don't know if we can cover that here, Jack.
Well, I did run into one lady that was, just to hug her was an act of sex to her.
Oh.
So I came up with hugging is shoulder to shoulder, face to face, nothing else do we embrace.
That's very good.
Anyways, I've turned it into, it's a joy for me to help them. And they all know that they can come to me. I power wash their patios, even widowers too, as well. But what started off to be a momentous challenge, I just do and I love it. It's what I do almost every day.
Well, good. It's a habit for you now. All right. It's time to wrap up. For application, I think Joshua said it best when he said, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And that's that's our lesson on obedience. See you next week. Thank you so much.